Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again. This is the fourth part in a series of videos that make up a tutorial called Building a Markdown Blog with React. And in this video we're just going to add we're going to add one static page using React Router. And it's going to be an about page for our product. So if you go into your main directory and you go into your pages folder, we have one page so far, and that's the home page. And recall that with our home page, we display a list of posts, of blog posts that we've written. We'd also like to have an about page that maybe says something about our blog. So what we can do now in our pages directory, we can create a folder called content, and this will be markdown content that we're going to use to create the content for our static pages. For example, I can create an about page just using a simple JavaScript file, and then I can add in, say, using a paragraph tag, some text. But I'd rather just write the whole thing in Markdown, and that's easy enough to do. What we can do is we can create a Markdown content folder in our pages folder. So let's do that now. Okay, and then within that content folder, we'll actually create a markdown file just called about. So let's do that. Okay, and we go in here and we see that we've got that. And I've already created something before, so we can use that. All right. So let's go ahead and add that to our about .md file. I believe I changed our fictional friend Dave's information to make it so that he's actually from Montreal. Okay, so we have that, and this is, just like before, we want to bring in our markdown into our JavaScript file and then use our markdown parser to render it, just like we did before. So recall, before, our home page was just a list of posts, right? And we were able to grab just the first, I think it was 20 words in the content, so that we could just use those as an excerpt. And then later on when we add the ability to click on the post title as a link, that'll take us to a page that displays the full blog post. We haven't set that up yet, and we'll do that in the next video. Okay, we can stop that for now. So let's also create an about page, right, and we'll call that about.js. Sometimes you see me using the terminal to create pages, and sometimes I just do it like I did now. Don't pay any attention to that. I'm as inconsistent as anyone can be. So of course we'll need React. Okay, and then we can just make sure that, well, we haven't added a root to it yet. We're going to do that next, but to make sure, we'll need something to display. So we'll just display this. Okay. So go into your index.js file, because as you know, with React, unless you use React Router, you're not going to be able to have an automatic route to these pages. So we'll have to set that up. So if you go into your index.js file, and you can import the about page, we'll just call it about. We can create a root to that, and these are static roots. So now we'll say, instead of just // we'll use / about, and then of course our component will be the about component. Alright, so now we have that root and it should be working. So if we run our package or our project, alright. Module not found. What did I not do? Cannot resolve this. Where did I put that? This is probably one of those things I did quickly and I just don't even, oh, sorry about that. It's always good to slow down and just think about what you're doing sometimes. You might make a typo. Fortunately, we didn't do much, so it was easy to backtrack. Okay, so we should be rendering now. Good, and we are. And if I add in that root up here in the address bar, that should take me to the about page that we just created, and it does. Good. So now, of course, we don't want this to be our content. We want our markdown file to be our content. So maybe you're thinking that we could just bring in our markdown parser. All right. Also, we could maybe bring in our about page or our about file or our markdown content by importing the file. Let's just call it about text. Remember, we get that from our content folder, and the name of the file was about.md. Alright, so if we were to try to just put in our content using the markdown component from react-markdown, recall we need to have some source text or a source string. If we wanted to see HTML, we had to use escape HTML. Right, then let's see what we have. Well, if you see here, you get this, right? And that's because in order to bring in all of that content as a string, we need to do something, right? You could use a Webpack package called raw loader, and it says here that allows you to import a file as a string, right? But first of all, we're using create React app, so unless we eject, then we're not going to be able to alter our Webpack config file, right? And you know, there may be reasons for ejecting. You might find that this is a good enough reason for you, but I think that unless you really understand the consequences of ejecting, then it's better not to do it. But that's a topic for a different conversation. For now, what I'd like to do is just show you how you can easily handle this yourself without importing a package and relying on another dependency. All right, so what we can do is we can go back to our main.js file in our public folder. Remember, that's where we got all of our blog posts that were stored as markdown files. Right. Well, we can do the same thing for all of our pages that are stored as markdown files. We can just create another function called getPages. So for now, what you can do is copy this function. Below the other one. Right, but you're not going to call it get posts, you're going to call it get pages. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to go into a directory and we're going to grab all of the files from that directory and open them up one by one. In this case, we've got one file in our content directory now, but we can't use dir path anymore, right? Remember, this is not function scoped, right? So it's global here in this context. So let's create another path for our pages directory, and we can just call it dir path pages. Right, but now we're not going here, we're going into the pages folder and then into the content folder in there. And also we're not going to be dealing with the post list, we're going to create a new array called page list. And we're just doing the same thing in principle. We're creating an array of objects where each object is going to be a markdown file that represents a page, or that has the page content. So initialize that to be an empty array. Okay, go back down to your get pages function, update the variable for your path. Remember, that's dir path pages. Okay, we're not going to parse out any metadata because remember, with our about.md file, right, these are our markdown pages. We're not adding in any post metadata, right? Because they're not posts. They're going to be static pages that we don't expect to update very often, if at all. So we just want to get all of the content in there. We don't need to worry about parsing out the metadata. So if that's the case, then we can get rid of this function, this function, this function, and basically all of this. Right, we're not calling those functions anymore because we don't have the functions. All right, so again, update your file path or your directory path. We don't have to worry about updating the file path variable because this is function scoped. Right, so there's only an effect happening within the function. We don't have to worry about altering something global. Now if we want to, well, first of all, all this is going to give us an error if we leave it in. And actually we don't need any of this, right? Because we're not creating posts, we're creating pages. So delete that. And create a page object. And of course, define our variable up here. It's page, not post. And then we're going to we already created a variable called, or we defined a variable called page list. So let's do that here. And we're going to push to that array individual page objects, not posts. And then we don't want any of this logic to execute right now. So go ahead and comment it out. And let's just take a look at the contents to make sure we know what we're getting from our file. And if this doesn't make sense to you, of course, you can go back to the first video where we set up this logic for individual posts, and from there you'll be able to understand what we're doing right now. So let's go ahead and stop our React project from running and run our server. Okay, we're not logging anything to the console there. And of course that's because we have to invoke our function. So we go down here. Okay, do the run server thing again. Good. And now we see that our contents from an individual file is just everything in that file. And that's the way we wanted it to be. We want to use everything in that markdown file as far as our markdown files that represent pages are concerned. So like I said, we don't have to worry about parsing out any metadata. We're just going to use all of the contents. So things will be a little bit easier here. Alright, so we don't need that statement anymore. Go ahead and uncomment everything that you just commented out. Okay, so for here, the only thing we'll need to change is post list to page list. All right, and also we're going to write it to a file not called posts, but probably, as you guessed, pages. All right, and we can write it to the same directory. We're just going to put it in the source directory, and it'll go right next to the other JSON file. Okay, so now if we run our server, we should see in our source directory next to our post.json file a pages.json file. So hopefully that happens. So let's run our server. Good. And we see that we've got a pages.json file, and if we open it up, it is empty. So let's see what we forgot to do. Excuse me. And by the way, we don't need to sort the files in this directory, right? We're going to remember the order that we put them in. These are going to be static files, so we don't have to worry about that. So let's get rid of this logic here. Camel casing it there. Good, undo that. Just to make sure that wasn't the source of our problem, let's run the server again. Okay, go back into our pages.json file. Okay, so that wasn't the source of our problem. What do we forget to do here? We haven't actually created a page object. I'm sorry, that was terrible. Good, so let's do that now. And what we'll want is just the contents, right? So we'll just create a property called content. That'll be the page content, and it'll be the contents of the file, which we already logged to the console, and we know that's everything in the page markdown file. Okay, so if we run our server now, and we take a look again at our pages.json, now we see that we get that object inside of our page list array that represents an individual static page. And then we use the content property to access this string, right, which we can then pass into our markdown component to make it work. Okay, so now if you go back to your about.js file, right, we don't want to bring in our markdown file directly. We want to bring in our content from our pages.json file. And recall that was in the about page is in the pages directory. So if we go out of that, that'll take us back into the source directory, and then we can access the pages.json file. And just to make sure that we're bringing it in, and let's go ahead and comment this out for now. We can log it to the console. Go ahead and run the React project. Good. All right, so if we open up the console, we see that we are bringing in an array with one element, so that's looking good for us, right? And we see that that one element is our markdown page, right? And that its content is the string that we need to bring in and pass into our source prop. So go ahead and uncomment this, because now we're going to use our markdown component. And we don't need this statement anymore. Okay, so if we just try directly to pass in about text to our markdown component, you can guess what's going to happen, right? We're supposed to pass in a string, right? But right now what we're doing is we're passing in the whole array, right? So we'll have to say, and like I said, these markdown pages are going to be static pages, and we're not going to update them, so we don't need to worry about setting up a bunch of logic that figures out which page we need to look at. We can just say, hey, let the first file in that content folder be the about page, right? And if that's the case, then all we need is the first object in the pages.json file, which gives us an array. And we need the first object in this array, so that will be at the index 0. So we can say about text at index 0. And then remember again, we're looking at the first object in that array, and then we want the value associated with the property content. So we'll need to also say dot content. All right, and if we look now, we see that there it is. And if you want to, style everything up, you can put your markdown component within a div, right? And we can just call this div page content. Right, then we can style this div. And let's do this within the pages directory. Right, so we can create a new file called pages.css. We've already got that file. Oh, there it is. So we had a class of page content. We can set the widths to say 40%. Margin auto, and text align to be centered. Okay. Now you can see that whether our iframe is not mobile responsive, and since this tutorial is not about how to make things mobile responsive or not, I'll let you handle that. But at least we are displaying the HTML content of our about page, right, without using something like raw loader and having to eject our create React app. Good. And we're going to get rid of this at some point. But for now, I just want to center it to make sure everything's working okay. So anytime I'm going to throw something away, like an element later on, I'll just use inline styling. I won't worry about going into the CSS, into the style sheet and messing around. So we'll say here text align and center it. And also let's just put some space between it and the page content. All right. But you notice we don't have our header, right? If we go back to our home page, we don't have that. So we can use our layout in here. Okay, there. So also, rather than having to enter the about route up here in the address bar, we can create links. So if you go into, well, first let's make a nav bar component and we'll put it underneath our header. All right, so we don't have a nav bar component yet. Make one. And then we'll need links, so we have to import those from React router DOM. All right, so the first link, we'll just call it link to the home page. And we'll make the second link to the about page. And also what we'll probably want to do is get rid of the underlines in our links and whatnot. So we'll have to give these classes. And probably we can just do that with all of our links in our blog. So I'll set that to just links, not nav bar links, because I'd probably like to have all of my links without underlines. And maybe give them a different color as well. All right, and then you can go in, oh, we've got to export this too, don't forget. So in your components.css, I don't know, let's use brown. I think that'll stand out nicely. Okay. So the one thing we haven't done is we haven't put our nav bar anywhere yet, and I'd like to use it in the layout. So if you go to your layout, we're going to put it under the header. Okay, there it is. It's showing up. And of course, it looks terrible right now because we haven't done anything to style it. So remember, for our Nav Bar, we created a class name, or a class called Nav Bar. So put that right under the header. Alright, so there are our links right here, and if we click the About, or the Home, that'll take us to our home page. We click About, that takes us to the About page. So the links are working. Well, anyway, stylistically it doesn't look great, but at least we've got what we want working. So that should be good. I think there's nothing else that we needed to cover in this video. So good. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to create dynamic routes so that we can link to an individual blog post by just filling in a blog post template with the content that we get from our post list object, the post object that's within our post list. So for now I'm going to stop, and I will see you next time when we do that. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please leave a comment in the comments below the video. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.